The University of Johannesburg's political analyst, Prof Steven Friedman, says that the controversial Green Paper by Social Development Minister Lindiwe Zulu deserved to be heard. He wrote that Green Papers are supposed to be discussion documents, but that after the media's disinformation campaign on the proposed National Social Security Fund, no deliberation is possible. He joins us now. A very good afternoon to you, Professor Friedman, and thank you for your time. Now, you are saying that this Green Paper deserved to be heard. Why?
Good afternoon, Ty. Well, it deserved to be heard because it's a serious policy proposal. And as you pointed out in your intro, it was reported throughout, not only on legacy media, but on WhatsApp, etc. It was reported throughout as a government decision, as a proposed government decision. It was never that. It was a Green Paper, and Green Papers are discussion documents. They are supposed to elicit criticism and debate and discussion. So the fact that the government issues a Green Paper doesn't mean that it's going to do what is in the Green Paper. It's asking citizens' opinion of whether that's what it should do, and if not, what else should it do. So that was entirely inaccurate. Secondly, the fact that you don't like a proposal, which was the view of sections of the financial media and certain lobby groups, doesn't mean that it doesn't get heard in a democracy. In a democracy, everything should get heard. And really, this was not the kind of proposal which was so outrageous that it had no right to be heard. It was also, of course, misrepresented. Not only was it presented as something that the government had already decided, when in fact it wasn't, but it was presented as a new tax. And it never was proposed as a new tax. What was proposed was a new fund in which employers and employees would contribute. Now, you're perfectly entitled as a citizen to say, or as an interest group to say that you don't like that. But to continually say that this is a new tax, and certainly in the suburbs on WhatsApp groups, etc., because some of the people showed these things to me, people were saying, well, the government has got this new tax which is going to take everybody's money away. None of which was vaguely true. So if we're going to simply misrepresent and slander policy proposals, then we're never going to have a serious debate in this country.
This Green Paper has subsequently been withdrawn, Professor Friedman. If there's so much misinformation around it, and it is being withdrawn before any sort of deliberation on it can take place, before any sort of robust debate of it can take place, why then is the government even withdrawing it? Why does the Green Paper not do what it is supposed to do?
Because the government is terrified of the lobby groups. The government is terrified of interest groups. The government believes at the moment that the only way we are going to get the economy to revive is if businesses start to invest, and therefore you shouldn't defend anything, but business people at all. Now that's not a very democratic attitude, but it's a particularly silly attitude when you realize that business people believe different things. So some business people support proposals, others don't. But the government is terrified about offending the lobbies. And really there's a great irony here, because one of the reasons why the disinformation campaign works is that many people in the suburbs believe that the government is just waiting for an opportunity to take away their money. Actually, what the government is doing is bending over backwards to make them feel good. And it creates this very ironic situation where the new minister in the presidency, Mondli Ngubela, goes off to the media and says, well, we should, in a sense, be happy that this thing has gone. Why should we be happy that it's gone? It's a perfectly debatable proposal. Incidentally, it subsequently emerged that actually the contents of the Green Paper have been discussed within government for 10 years. So we've had these proposals which have been discussed within government for 10 years. But now, because some interest groups persuade people in the suburbs wrongly that they're about to be taxed, we can't discuss it any further. I'm not suggesting at all that it's a good proposal. I would like to hear both sides of the argument before I decide whether I think it's a good proposal. But we're never going to hear both sides of the argument because, as you correctly point out, the white paper has been withdrawn. The whole thing has been pulled under the carpet. And remember that whether the proposal is a good idea or not, the problem that the proposal is trying to address is a very important one. We do have many people in South Africa, particularly after COVID-19, who fall into poverty and don't have any social security. And that is causing great hardship to a great many South Africans. So whether you like this proposal or not, if we can't discuss sensible proposals, or not necessarily sensible in the sense that they should be recommended, but proposals that are sensitive to the poverty of the majority of South Africans and come up with ideas about how to deal with that, then what are we going to discuss?
This, Professor Friedman, was one of government's attempts to tackle the issue of poverty in South Africa, outlining different structures and ideas for economic change. One of the propositions that were in that green paper was the possible establishment of a national social security fund. How would that have worked, and how would a fund of that nature affect big business, who is, as you say, anti this particular proposition?
Well, actually, it's not even true to say that all of big business is opposed to this proposition. Essentially, the way it would work is that employers and employees would contribute to a fund which would be available to deal with unemployment and with disability, and which would also be available for those people who don't have that option as some kind of pension on their retirement. It was a very modest proposal, in fact. But what upset sections of business was that the Green Paper said that this should be available to workers earning up to 260,000 rand a year, and that it should also they should contribute 8 to 12% of their income of their earnings. And a lot of people in business felt that, or organized business felt that this was too high, because it took business away from the private insurance industry, private savings industry. And I suspect also that they might have felt that if workers had to contribute too much, they would ask for big wage increases. But this is very interesting because, in fact, the organized business's response to this was not to say this is an absolute disaster. It was to say we don't like the details. So what we have here is a huge backlash against discussing the details of the proposal. Had this been discussed, it's quite possible that we would have landed up with something very much like what organized business was suggesting. But if you don't have a conversation, you obviously can't come to any sort of compromise about what we should do.
How would these type of propositions have affected private saving schemes, for example?
Well, the Green Paper does make the point that obviously if people have the option of a public scheme, then that obviously creates competition for the private schemes. Interestingly enough, though, if you look at the Green Paper, it makes the point that for many employees, the fund would not have been enough. And it actually says in the Green Paper that employees higher up the scale would be encouraged to actually use the private funds. But obviously, if you have a new government fund, it means more competition for the private fund. But certainly it would not be true to say that this was going to be a serious threat to the private savings industry. Incidentally, 26,000 rand a month, it's 260,000 rand a year is 23,000 rand a month. That is in South African terms quite a lot of money. But the big income for the private savings industry doesn't even come from people below that. It comes from people earning above that, and that wouldn't have been affected at all.
So there are also talks, Professor Friedman, that even within this green paper, factions within the ANC were responsible for a proposal of this nature. Talk to us about how dynamics of that sort found themselves into discussions of political ideas on economic change.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, there's no evidence to support it. It's had nothing to do with factional politics because, as I say, I mean, besides the fact that it's been around for 10 years, the people who drafted the white paper are not involved in factional politics. But you see, your question is an interesting one because what happens is, if you don't have the information, if you assume that this is a mad scheme to take away everybody's money and waste it on some kind of government vanity project, then you say to yourself, well, why are people introducing it at a time when we have economic hardship? Why are they trying to sabotage the attempt to get investment? And then you come up with the idea, well, the Minister of Social Security is Lindiwe Zulu. She was, during Mr. Zuma's presidency, a supporter of the president. Therefore, she must be doing this, or people around this firm must be doing this in order to further a factional agenda. But you come to that conclusion because you either haven't read the right green paper, or you've decided it's in your interest to misrepresent it. And that argument only makes sense if the green paper is the mad document which the misrepresentations say it isn't. But if you take it for what it is, a perfectly normal policy proposal, which has been around for a while, then obviously it's got nothing to do with factional politics. So the fact that it was ascribed to factional politics is itself a symptom of the problem I'm concerned about, is that whenever we have a proposal to deal with poverty in this country, which might affect the interests of some economic group, interest group, business group somewhere, then we suddenly have this massive campaign to say, middle-class people are going to have their incomes taken away. And as long as that's the case, we're not going to do anything about poverty in this country. Because whenever we try to do something about poverty, somebody somewhere is going to start a campaign about this. The proposal will be withdrawn, and people in poverty in South Africa will remain in poverty.
So as we wrap up, Professor Friedman, what impact has this entire experience with this green paper had on future deliberation papers?
Well, I think that's also an excellent question because it's had what we call a chilling effect. In the article I wrote about it, I say towards the end, we won't see proposals like this for quite a long time because anybody who has a proposal like this is going to be scared. And certainly it doesn't really matter whether they're scared or not because it's obvious from the government's withdrawal of the paper and from Minister Bungubela's response, which obviously reflects the government position, that they're not going to go anywhere near this anytime soon. So it essentially means that at a time when poverty, everybody agrees that poverty in South Africa is worse than normal, although it's always high, because of COVID-19. We have a situation now where, in effect, a gag has been placed on discussing policy proposals which might deal with poverty. And that means that nobody is going to come to the aid of poor South Africans by introducing policies which might help them, and that is an extremely serious matter.
Professor Steven Friedman, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for your time.